All right, we are recording. So we are going to talk this week about the nervous system and the endocrine system. Let me go ahead and start the slideshow here. All right, so we'll start off with just a little kind of overview of the organization of the nervous system, because it can be kind of difficult to keep all of this in place in your heads. So your overall nervous system, we can divide into two major branches, and that's going to be the peripheral nervous system and the central. The central nervous system, if we break that down, central is just the brain and the spinal cord. So just those two major structures. The peripheral nervous system is going to include all of the nerves that branch off of the brain and branch off of the spinal cord. And all of those nerves can be further subdivided into two categories, either autonomic or somatic. And then we'll look at the kind of further breakdown of those categories as we go through this. So the overall job of your nervous system, it's kind of the system that's in charge of everything, right? The purpose is to be able to detect changes in the environment, whether that's the external environment, like it's getting too cold outside, so we need to adjust our body temperature because of that, or internal environment, like our blood sugar is too high, we need to adjust that down, right? So it's detecting those changes in the environment and then making decisions on how to respond to those changes appropriately. So here's our divisions of the nervous system again. So central and then peripheral. Here you can see central is just the brain and the spinal cord. And then peripheral would be all of these nerves that branch off of the brain and branch off of the spinal cord. Some terminology for you. When we look at, and we kind of have talked about some of these cells before, right? We talked about a neuron back when we were looking at different tissues, maybe in week one, right? So a neuron is just the major cell of the nervous system. And if we look at a neuron, it's got a cell body to it. In fact, let's see if I got a picture, right? So here's a neuron. So it's got a cell body. It's got these dendrites that branch off of the cell body, and then it's got a long axon. Right, so we tend to find neurons grouped together. And where we find them grouped together, we're going to refer to these groups of neurons. Right, so a ganglia or ganglion is going to be a group of cell bodies that we find in the peripheral nervous system. So the body, the soma of the neuron, if we've got a group of them all together in the peripheral nervous system, that's a ganglion. If we find that a similar group of cell bodies in the central nervous system, we call it a nucleus, right? So just the group of cell bodies together is either a ganglion or a nucleus, right? Similarly, if we find a group of axons together, so just the long string axon part of the neuron, a group of axons in the peripheral nervous system is called a nerve. So that's all a nerve is, it's just a bundle of axons together. A bundle of axons in the central nervous system is called a tract. So the tract is going to be found in the brain or the spinal cord. So just to kind of refresh this, because we believe we mentioned the difference between neurons and neuroglia back in week one. But neurons, these are the real functional unit of your nervous system. A neuron is the cell that can send and receive electrical impulses or action potentials, the one that's actually sending and receiving messages. Neuroglia or glial cells, these are helper cells. Right? They help the neurons do their job. They help protect and support the neurons, but they do not send and receive messages. So they're just helpers. So here's that neuron that we were just looking at. All right, so a neuron itself is a very large cell. So it's got this cell body, and that's where we find the nucleus and a bunch of the other kind of recognizable organelles in there. You can see some endoplasmic reticula, some mitochondria. Um, we see these dendrites branching off of the cell body. Dendrites are there to receive electrical signals. Right? So electrical signals are always received on the dendrite side of the neuron, right? And then that electrical signal can wash over the cell body and down the axon. Right? So the axon is the other side of this where the signal is being sent away, and you can see it goes, it's a very long axon, all the way down here to the bottom where we hit these axon terminals. Right, so axon terminals always end in a synaptic end bulb. As we go down the axon, just go back 1 second and point out that the axon is wrapped in other cells, right? So these cells that are kind of wrapping around the axon, these are called Schwann cells if we're in the peripheral nervous system. Those Schwann cells are, they're basically just helper cells that sort of wrap around the axon over and over again. You can see a demonstration of that here, right? So it's just a cell that's wrapped around and around. What that does is help protect the axon and it encloses it in a fatty membrane called myelin. So remember that your cell membranes are all made up of phospholipids, so a little bit of fat in there. And if we take a cell that has a membrane made of phospholipids and we wrap it around and around and around an axon, now we've got a nice fatty layer of myelin. It's going to help protect the axon and help speed up signal transmission. So as that axon is sending an electrical impulse, the myelin helps to protect it and increase the speed of that signal. All right, so here again, we can see an axon with these Schwann cells wrapped around it that are creating this myelin sheath. But notice that there are gaps in the myelin sheath, and those are called nodes of Ranvier. And those again are going to be important in understanding how signals are transmitted down the length of the axon. Right? But the myelin is an incredibly important part of your nervous system. If you don't have a myelin sheath, it will slow down signals considerably to the point where you would have a lot of trouble operating your nervous system without it. So diseases like multiple sclerosis, so multiple sclerosis or MS, is an autoimmune disease that where the immune system is attacking those Schwann cells, attacking the myelin. Which causes a lot of progressive problems in your nervous system function. All right, so let's look at some of the neuroglia then. Okay, so we have a bunch of different neuroglia that all have different jobs. So again, these are just the helper cells. Right, so um, the helper cells here, we'll start off with an astrocyte. So an astrocyte is a glial cell that we only find in the central nervous system. The job of the astrocyte is to create the blood-brain barrier. So if you've never heard of the blood-brain barrier, it's just like an extra layer of membrane that surrounds the blood vessels in the brain to help protect the brain from any toxins that are circulating in the blood, right? So astrocytes are the type of glial cells that do that job. Oligodendrocytes, these are basically the Schwann cells of the central nervous system. So they are the ones wrapping around the axon and creating that myelin sheath in the brain and the spinal cord. Microglia, these are glial cells that they sort of have an immune function. They are your brain's version of macrophages, right? So they're really good at ingesting pathogens or ingesting debris, cleaning up a mess in the brain and spinal cord. And then ependymal cells. These ones are specialized glial cells that create cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid is the fluid that bathes and cushions the brain and the spinal cord. Right? So it's a special clear fluid that's generated by those ependymal cells. And then in the peripheral nervous system, we've got a couple different types of um, glial cells. Those are the Schwann cells that we already mentioned that are creating the myelin, and then satellite cells, which serve like a protective and supportive function. Let's think about how signals are transmitted, right? That's the whole point of the nervous system, is to be able to send and receive signals, detecting changes in the environment and adjusting body systems to meet those challenges. So we can look at any branch of the nervous system, and we're basically going to have three parts to it. We're going to have sensory information. So that's information that is coming from your senses, whether it's the sense of touch or the sense of smell or sight or taste or whatever it might be. That's carrying information to the brain, right? So if we're going toward the brain, that's sensory, also referred to as afferent with an A, going towards the brain with an A. We also then have the opposite of that, right? We have messages that are leaving the brain. Those are motor signals. So if the brain wants to send a signal to, get away from something that's hot, you might get a motor signal from the brain telling your muscles to move you away from that thing. So that's a motor or efferent with an E pathway. Okay, so afferent goes toward the brain, efferent goes away from the brain. And then in between there, in the actual brain, is an interneuron. So an interneuron is the one that sort of connects those two pathways. So we always have an afferent pathway going to an interneuron and then an efferent pathway going back out. So that's true whether we're talking about any branch of the peripheral nervous system. So we said that brain and spinal cord were central, and then the peripheral nervous system is all the nerves that branch off of that. So peripheral nervous system could be referring to the somatic nervous system. So somatic, meaning related to the body, this is going to be the part of your nervous system that you have conscious control over. So that is controlling your skeletal muscles, right? All those skeletal muscles that we talked about last week. So somatic nervous system covers or directs those skeletal muscles what to do. The autonomic nervous system, when you hear autonomic, think automatic. So this is happening kind of at an automatic subconscious level. You don't have voluntary control over your autonomic nervous system. This is what's controlling things like your breathing and your heart rate and your digestion. You don't have direct control over that. And then there are, depending on which book you're reading, they may subdivide autonomic and give it this separate category of enteric. The enteric nervous system is just all the neurons that are associated with the gut or digestion, right, which takes a surprising amount of nervous pathways that are directed to digesting and absorbing the food that you eat. All right. And then if we look at that autonomic or that automatic nervous system, you can further subdivide that category into sympathetic and parasympathetic. So you may have heard your sympathetic nervous system referred to as your fight or flight response. So sympathetic activity is a sort of like a heightened response to danger, right? So if there's perceived danger in your environment, something scary is happening, then you'll have increased sympathetic activity or that fight or flight response. The opposite of that is parasympathetic. Parasympathetic is going to refer to the, you might hear it referred to as rest and digest. It's more of your sort of calmer side of the nervous system that's telling your body that everything's okay and we can just sit down and have a meal or just relax. So hopefully all those kind of divisions of the nervous system make sense. Are there any questions about that so far?
Isn't the myelin sheath what also is in charge of the dementia? If I remember correctly, it plays into the dementia role a lot.
Um, so deterioration of the myelin sheath can result from a buildup of plaque in the brain, right? And there's a lot of research now that's looking at those microglial cells. Those are the ones responsible for phagocytosis. Maybe they're not doing their job to clean the brain as well as we age, and so that buildup of kind of debris and plaque can do damage to the neurons there, including their myelin sheaths. That's a really good question. So we'll move on to looking at parts of the brain. Okay, so focusing on the central nervous system here for a minute. Um, so our human brain is really large compared to other mammal brains, right? So we have pretty well developed cerebrum with a bunch of different lobes to it. So we'll kind of look at all the pieces and parts here of the brain. So we can sort of roughly divide the brain into these four different regions. So we've got a brain stem. The brain stem you can think of as like the oldest part of your brain. This is a part of the brain that we share with pretty much every other vertebrate on the planet are going to have these kind of similar structures in the brain stem. Brain stem is important for keeping you alive, right? Basic life support functions. Cerebellum is the part of the brain that's going to be responsible for coordination and muscle memory, motor control. Diencephalon is sort of like this middle part of the brain that's deep into the brain that helps kind of send messages where they're supposed to go and control maintenance of homeostasis. And then the largest part of the brain is your cerebrum. So the cerebrum, that's the outer part of the brain that you really see when you're looking at the brain. This is the largest part, and it's also the part that controls, your conscious thoughts um, and things like that. So if we look at a sagittal section of the brain here, you can see some of those parts. So down here, this is the brain stem. Back here is the cerebellum. The diencephalon is right here. And then everything here in this kind of darker orange color, all of this is cerebrum, right? So the cerebrum is really the largest part of the brain. Cerebrum, we can divide into like a deeper cerebrum and then cerebral cortex, which is the sort of outer folds. The cerebral cortex we can divide into different lobes. And the lobes are pretty simple. They're just named after the bones that they sit deep to. So frontal lobe sits deep to the frontal bone, parietal, temporal, and occipital. We can also even get a little bit more detailed. And instead of just looking at the lobes, we can look at regions on those lobes and what their functions are. And there are, the brain has been mapped backwards and forwards. We still don't fully understand all of it for sure, but there are a bunch of these different regions here that we can further kind of subdivide and try to understand what these regions are doing. You do not have to know all of these, but there are a few that are interesting. So if we look at the frontal lobe, for example, so it goes all the way from here back to this central sulcus. That's the dividing line between the frontal in the front and the parietal posteriorly. But this frontal lobe is going to be responsible in the prefrontal area for um, sort of your most kind of like higher level thought, problem solving, being able to kind of think through and sort through problems, and then having, some sort of cognitive control over your behaviors. We also have conscious motor control coming from the frontal lobe. So all the kind of movements of your body that you have conscious control over. Speech, motor speech, so the ability to speak, and forming those words with your mouth. That's all happening in the frontal lobe as well. Right, so we can see all these different sort of mapped areas, and that's just the frontal lobe, right? So the parietal lobe has its own jobs, temporal, occipital, there's all different functions there. So temporal lobe, you can think about it as being like sitting sort of right behind your ear. So the temporal lobe has a lot to do with auditory processing, so processing the senses coming in from your ear. Part of your limbic system is there as well. So limbic system being in charge of emotions and emotional memories. And then memory in general. We find a lot of that stored in the temporal lobe. And then parietal lobe. So parietal lobe thinks sensory input. So all of your sense of touch in particular is going to be processed by the parietal lobe. So the fact that, you know, if I touch my hand, I know that I've touched my hand. I can feel that and sort of understand where that sense is coming from because it's being mapped in the parietal lobe. Frontal lobe, again, any kind of voluntary motor function, speech, all of the higher level sort of cognitive processing that you're able to do. So understanding this lecture, all of that is processed in the frontal lobe. And then occipital lobe is almost entirely dedicated to vision. So your sense of sight is a complicated one that takes up a lot of brain processing power, and most of that's happening in the occipital lobe. All right. So let's look at this. Do I have a picture of it? Yeah. So this primary somatosensory area, which sounds complicated. This is where your sense of touch is mostly processed. So I mentioned that's in the parietal lobe. So it's in the gyrus. So gyrus is just a bump on the surface of the brain. So it's in a gyrus that's right behind the central sulcus. And if we look at that gyrus, you can kind of map on the surface of the brain the neurons that are dedicated to interpreting the sense of touch coming from different parts of the body. So if we look at it here, it's kind of like this distorted human figure that's been mapped on the surface of the brain here. So you can see how much of the brain is dedicated to understanding the sense of touch in the hand and in the face. And then other parts of the body where you don't have as many sensory neurons, like the trunk or the hip, we've got less brain dedicated to understanding those, right? Because the neurons are farther apart and you just have a less detailed sense of touch in those areas, very detailed in the hands and the face. Right. Similar thing is true for your motor muscle control, right? So you've got a lot of tiny little muscles in the hands and in the face that you've got very delicate control over, right? We talked about motor units last week and how small motor units have very fine control and how larger motor units you don't have as much detailed control over. So those would be, again, like the trunk, the hip, the buttocks. Those are really large muscle groups. So you don't have as much of the brain dedicated to their motion because you don't need as much. They're all kind of connected together. So you just get these sort of larger movements. All right. So deep in the cerebrum, so we've been mostly talking about cerebral cortex or that kind of outermost layer. But if we look deeper into the cerebrum, we've got groups of cell bodies called the basal nuclei. These basal nuclei are going to be really important for helping to suppress unwanted movements and regulate your muscle tone. So just sort of maintaining muscle control and not having a lot of like unnecessary sort of like twitching or spasms of the muscles. And the main neurotransmitter that we use there to control all that is dopamine, which is why lack of dopamine in that area leads to Parkinson's disease, right? So Parkinson's is, you see a lot of unwanted motor activity, a lot of like spasming and jerky movements because of that lack of dopamine in these basal nuclei. All right, and then the limbic system. So limbic system is kind of everywhere. So it's not isolated to just one part of the brain. It sort of spreads throughout the cerebrum, the midbrain, diencephalon. But the limbic system is primarily associated with your emotions, right? So when you feel an emotion, that's your limbic system. And emotions serve a function, right? They serve this function of protection, right? To protect you from things that are dangerous and to drive you towards things that are rewarding or good. So the emotions there are functional, and then higher parts of the brain help you to kind of control and regulate those emotional drives. So there's your limbic system. Again, kind of spread all over the place. The major components of the limbic system, though, are going to be down here. The amygdala and the hippocampus, again, have to do with emotions and emotional memories. All right. So all that was mostly cerebrum. We'll move down now to the diencephalon. So diencephalon is these structures here that are kind of this red or orangish color in the picture. These are going to be the thalamic structures. They have a few different functions. So we'll start with the thalamus. The thalamus you can think of as being sort of a router or a relay area of the brain. So the thalamus's job is to pick up sensory impulses that are coming through those sensory or afferent pathways toward the brain. The thalamus receives those messages and then sends them to the parts of the cerebral cortex where they're supposed to go, right? So if I've got a sense of touch from my hand, that follows an afferent pathway to the brain. The thalamus will then send it to the correct part of the parietal lobe so that I can perceive it as touch of the hand, right? If it's another sensation, the thalamus will route it wherever it needs to go. So processing and sending those peripheral sensations where they're supposed to go. So, and then thalamus is right there. So kind of right dead center of the brain. Attached to the thalamus, sort of a little bit anterior, a little bit inferior, is the hypothalamus. So hypothalamus, when you think of hypothalamus, you should think of homeostasis. Helps you maintain homeostasis. And it does some of the major things like, regulating your body temperature. So keeping you at that, roughly 98.6 degrees. Also tells you if you're hungry, helps to tell you if you're thirsty, to maintain water and fluid balance. It is also the connection between your nervous system and your endocrine system. So we'll get to endocrine system towards the end of today, but your hypothalamus is sort of the connection between those two body systems. So a lot of really important jobs. And then if we look at just kind of, we'll go back here and show you the hypothalamus again. So hypothalamus is right here. And then hanging off of the hypothalamus, we've got this little stalk called the infundibulum that leads to the pituitary gland. Right, so pituitary gland is the major gland of your endocrine system. And so now you can see, just because of the anatomy and the close association between the hypothalamus and the pituitary, how these two structures are the sort of connection point between nervous and endocrine system. All right, so that was thalamus and hypothalamus. If we get down here into the brainstem, there are three main structures of the brainstem. It's going to be the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Right? And you can see just below the medulla is the spinal cord. So this is really the connection between the brain and the spinal cord. Brainstem in general, think of basic life support. So this part of the brain is keeping you alive, right? Keeping you breathing, maintaining heart rhythm, maintaining digestion. All of the really kind of basics are happening in the brainstem. We'll skip over decussation of the pyramids, but focus on the vital functions that are happening in the medulla. So we've got a cardiovascular center here in the medulla that's regulating the force of the contractions of your heart and also your heart rate, so how quickly it's beating. It's controlling your blood pressure by controlling the diameter of the blood vessels. So all that's being monitored by the medulla. There's also this respiratory rhythmicity center, so controlling the rate and rhythm of your breathing, right? So maintaining so even when you're not thinking about breathing, the breathing is maintained by the medulla. And then also basic ejection reflexes happen here. So when you eat something disgusting or inhale something disgusting, the body rejects that to save your life, right? So if you're, the triggering of vomiting, coughing, sneezing to get those things out of the body is all happening in the medulla. Right, just above the medulla sits the pons. Pons also is going to help with breathing. So there is a group of neurons. They're called the pontine respiratory group. It's not normally doing much when you're just quiet breathing, but it will help with forceful breathing. All right, and then all along the brainstem here. So again, medulla, pons, midbrain. We look at this, all the structures of the brainstem. There's this this functional group of neurons called the reticular activating system or reticular formation that kind of straddles all of those groups of the brainstem, and its job is wakefulness. This is what's controlling whether you're awake or asleep. So if the reticular activating system is active, then you are awake. When the reticular activating system is inactive, then you go to sleep. Right, so it just controls regular wakefulness or sleep. All right. I'm going to go back to that picture real quick and just point out that we're now moving to a structure that's behind the brainstem called the cerebellum. So this structure back here. All right, so the cerebellum, his job is really movement, coordination, maintaining your posture and balance, sort of muscle memory activities. So the fact that once you learn how to walk, you pretty much remember how to walk. Those muscle kind of memory activities are sort of imprinted in the cerebellum, and he maintains that that coordination. Once you learn how to ride a bike, you remember how to ride a bike. You remember how to play the piano. All of that kind of like motor memory is going to be encoded for in the cerebellum. Right, so you can see cerebellum just down there, kind of at the base of the skull. Right, so cerebrum, diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. So those are the major parts of the human brain. Any questions about those parts? Okay. We can see that coming off of the brain is the spinal cord. You can see here that the spinal cord goes through the vertebral canal here, which is the space that's those vertebral foramina that we talked about when we looked at the bones that create a space for the spinal cord to extend all the way down to the lumbar spine. So the spinal cord and the brain itself are going to be covered in protective layers called meninges. All right, so meninges are basically like layers of connective tissue that cover both the brain and the spinal cord for protective function. So there are, I guess I don't have a bigger picture. There are 3 layers of these meninges. The outermost layer is called the dura mater. So the dura mater is the toughest of the 3 layers. The dura mater is going to be the most superficial of the 3, so it's just deep to the bone. So if we look at your skull and your vertebrae, Just underneath that is where you'll find the dura mater. Deep to that is the arachnoid mater. Arachnoid mater is called that because if you think of arachnid, that's like spiders. This is where you've got a lot of blood vessels that look almost like a spider web. And then the deepest of the three meninges is the pia mater. So the pia mater is the most delicate of the three, and it is the layer that's actually touching the brain or touching the spinal cord. So again, yeah, dura mater, the toughest, that's the outermost layer. The middle, meninx is the singular of meninges. That's going to be the arachnoid mater. And then below that arachnoid mater is a space called the subarachnoid space before you get to the pia mater. So pia mater is the one that is touching the brain and spinal cord. Subarachnoid space is the area between the arachnoid and pia where we find cerebrospinal fluid. Right. So here's a look at a cadaver view of the spinal cord. So you can see the vertebral body here, spinous process, transverse processes of the bone. And here you see the spinal cord going through the bone and the meninges that are surrounding it. Right, so the pia mater is the one that's going to be touching the spinal cord itself. And then we've got that subarachnoid space where you're going to find cerebrospinal fluid bathing the whole spinal cord, then the arachnoid mater, and then the dura mater. All right. Any inflammation of those meninges would be considered meningitis. So meningitis can be really a dangerous disease. So there's bacterial meningitis or viral. The viral meningitis tends to be overcome on its own within a couple of weeks. Bacterial meningitis can be fatal very quickly, so very dangerous. Because if those meninges become inflamed, they're completely surrounded by bone. So there's no room for swelling to happen. The bone can't expand. So if the meninges swell, they put pressure on the brain itself and put pressure on the spinal cord, which is very dangerous. All right. So the spinal cord itself extends from just below the medulla oblongata all the way down through the vertebral canal until we hit about L1 or L2. So the spinal cord doesn't actually go all the way down to the end of the spine, right? It ends about L1, L2. And from that point forward, there will still be a group of nerves that branch down through that vertebral canal, but the cord itself ends. So the cord ends at a structure called the conus medullaris. And then beyond that, we've got the filum terminale. So filum terminale is sort of like the extension of the pia mater that goes beyond the conus medullaris. And then here you can see in this cadaver image, this kind of like spray of nerves that branch off of that. That's called the cauda equina or horse's tail because it kind of looks like a horse's tail, all these nerves sort of branching off the base of that. All right. All the way down the spinal cord, between each vertebra, we're going to see bundles of axons branching off of the spinal cord. So these are going to be called roots. So roots are either going to be axons that are going away from the cord, and they're sending efferent messages out to the body, or they're going to be neurons that are heading towards the cord, sending afferent messages to the brain. Right, so that could be going in either direction. Here you can see sort of like a cross section of the spinal cord, and you can see the nerves that are either entering the spinal cord, and they always enter from the back. So these dorsal roots are sensory, and then the motor efferents are going out the anterior side of the spinal cord, and those are going to your muscles to respond to whatever signal was received. We haven't mentioned yet the difference between white matter and gray matter. So if we look at a section through the brain here or a section through the spinal cord, you notice that some of the tissue looks a little darker and some of the tissue looks lighter. The gray matter, that's going to be mostly cell bodies and dendrites that do not have myelin on them. Right, so the myelin, remember we said was that like basically a cell membrane that's wrapped around and around and around. That's made of phospholipids. Phospholipids are mainly fat. Fat looks white, right? So your white matter is going to be areas of myelinated axons, right? So the deeper parts of the brain or these outer portions of the spinal cord, that's all white matter, which is myelinated axons. And gray matter is either unmyelinated axons or groups of cell bodies because the cell bodies don't have myelin surrounding them. Right. So let's look at the anatomy of a nerve here. So a nerve, we mentioned, is just a group of axons in the peripheral nervous system. The axons are going to be coated in connective tissue, right? So we've got a layer of connective tissue that surrounds a single axon. And then we've got groups of axons that are bound together with another layer of connective tissue. And then those groups of axons are called fascicles. This might sound familiar because it's the exact same way that your skeletal muscles are arranged, right? So in skeletal muscles, we had a muscle fiber that was surrounded by an endomysium. Here we've got an axon that's surrounded by an endoneurium. So neurium being related to nerve. And we've got a group of axons bound together as a fascicle, the fascicle surrounded by perineurium, and then a group of fascicles all bound together. That's a nerve surrounded by epineurium. So again, just connective tissue layers that are kind of holding these structures together. Alrighty. So we've got then these nerves that are branching off of the brain, branching off of the spinal cord. We've got a bunch of different categories of nerves. Well, really just, I guess, two. We can subdivide your peripheral nerves into being cranial nerves or spinal nerves. Cranial nerves branch off of the brain. Spinal nerves branch off of the spinal cord, right? And they're going to branch off between the vertebrae all the way down. So if you memorize all of your vertebrae, then memorizing the spinal nerve should be pretty straightforward. Remember that we had 7 cervical vertebrae. So there's going to be 8 cervical spinal nerves because they're branching out. We've got one that branches off before the first vertebra between the occipital bone and the atlas. So 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves, 12 pairs of thoracic, 5 pairs of lumbar, 5 pairs of sacral, and then 1 coccygeal pair of spinal nerves. Okay. And all of these neurons are going to follow the same pathways. So we've got sensory information that's going through across afferent pathways to the spinal cord and then eventually up to the brain. The neurons that are within the brain and spinal cord are your interneurons. They're going to process that information and then send out a motor response. So a really quick kind of version of that, that pathway is going to be a reflex arc. So a reflex arc is where we've got a single sensory neuron, an interneuron that's in the spinal cord, and then a motor neuron going out to an effector, in this case, a skeletal muscle. So the withdrawal reflex is a really simple example of this. So withdrawal reflex, in this case, you can see it looks like someone here stepped on a tack, right? So we've got basically pain, right? So we're getting a pain signal coming from damage to these cells here. So that's going to be sent through a sensory or afferent pathway to the spinal cord. Then we've got an interneuron in the spinal cord, and then a motor efferent here. So what's going to happen here is that interneuron in the spinal cord detects that this was pain and that it poses a danger. And we need to tell the muscles to quickly move away. So this is why when you step on a tack or something that hurts, the muscles of that leg and foot are going to jump back pretty quickly, right? Because they're going to sense that that was dangerous and we don't want to put any additional pressure on it, right? So that kind of reflex arc is happening so quickly that your foot withdraws from the pain before the signal is even processed in the brain, right? So that's what makes a reflex so quick, right? Is your brain hasn't yet processed it, but your spinal cord has told you to move away from the danger. And there are a bunch of reflexes, and these are kind of a good way to detect, how well the nervous system is functioning. So probably all been to the doctor where they've done this hammer reflex, where they're tapping a hammer against this patellar ligament. And what's happening then is if you put pressure on that patellar ligament, it stretches the quadriceps muscles, and stretch receptors in those muscles will tell your spinal cord that the muscle is being stretched. The interneuron then spins that information back around to a motor efferent in the quadriceps and basically causes you to kick, right? And all of that happens before the sensory information has reached the brain, right? So your leg is kicking before your brain even realizes what's happened. All right.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, absolutely.
If the spinal cord is doing this without the brain, like even, I guess, aware of it, when the brain is made of aware of it, does it just kind of process it as something that's been taken care of?
Yeah, basically it's like then you know that that's happened. You're consciously aware of it, but the motor action has already taken place. Right? So it's not as if you don't know, like the doctor hit you with the hammer, but your the motor sort of reflex as a response to that stretch receptor has already happened. It's a good question. So sensation versus perception. So I just want to point out that a lot of times we sort of conflate these two terms. Sensation is a message that's been picked up by a sensory receptor, right? So, and the sensory receptor is we're triggering an action potential essentially in that sensory receptor. Um, the sensory receptor could be like a pain receptor. It could be just a regular touch receptor that's feeling a sense of touch. It could be from your eyeballs. It could be like a photoreceptor. It could be a chemoreceptor that's sensing sense of taste or smell. All of that is just an electrical signal that's picked up by a sensory receptor. That's sensation. Perception is what happens in the brain. So perception is how you perceive that sensation. Okay, so the perception of pain is when that message reaches the brain and says, okay, we've triggered this nociceptor that's telling us that there's damage somewhere on the body, right? So sensation can happen without the perception, right? So the perception happens just a split second later. And we've got a bunch of different sensory receptors. Right? So mechanoreceptors are neurons that are sensitive to deformation. So literally, like when I touch my skin, the shape of the cells there changes to respond to that. That triggers an action potential in those mechanoreceptors, and they're going to send a signal to the brain. Thermoreceptors detect changes in temperature. Nociceptors detect pain. Photoreceptors detect light, and then chemoreceptors detect chemicals. So that's the chemicals in the food that you eat or the odors that you smell. Those are just chemicals that are triggering those receptors. And then osmoreceptors detect osmotic pressure. So those are within the body, detecting sort of like the saltiness, for lack of a better word, of your blood and body fluids. Oh, something happened on my slide. There was something else over there. I don't know what it was. But this concept, this difference between general and special senses. So general senses are senses that can be that are sensed everywhere, essentially all over the body. So your sense of touch is a general sense because I can feel touch in my head, I can feel touch in my fingers, I can feel touch in my toes. I can also feel temperature in all of those places. I can feel proprioception, which is sort of like awareness of your body's location in space. I can feel pain. All of that is general because I can detect them everywhere. So I've got sensory receptors all over the place for those general senses. Your special senses, these are localized in the head, right? And they have very special dedicated structures that facilitate those senses. So I can only see from my eyes, I can only taste from my mouth, I can only hear from my ears because those are special senses. So we'll go through kind of the special senses here. So olfaction and gustation, these are your sense of smell and taste. And they're really closely related because they're both chemosenses. They're both detecting chemicals. Um, and then they both sort of filter through your brain's limbic system, which is why they're both kind of associated with emotions, right? If you smell something that has sort of like a nostalgic smell, or you taste, grandma's cooking, something like that, you're going to have an emotional response to it. So they're chemosenses that are processed through the limbic system. So we'll start with gustation, or the sense of taste. You really only have 5 things that you can taste. So you can taste sour, sweet, bitter, salty, and umami, which is like a savory. And that's it, right? Anything else that you taste besides those 5 things is either combinations of those, so a little sour, a little sweet, or a little bitter, a little salty, or it's the gustation layered with the sense of smell on top of it. So your gustation comes down to those 5 different types of sensory receptors that are located in taste buds that are on the side of the little bumps on the surface of your tongue. So those little bumps that you see on the surface of your tongue are called lingual papillae. Those aren't taste buds. But if you microscopically kind of zoom in to the sides of those little bumps, there you can find little taste pores that have the entryway to the taste bud itself. So yeah, if we look at here, these are the lingual papillae on the surface of the tongue. And if you look at the little kind of valleys in between them, that's where the taste buds are located. Right, so for your taste buds to be able to pick up, these are just sensory neurons, for them to be able to pick up chemicals of senses from the food that you eat, you have to chew that food. It has to dissolve in the saliva, and the saliva has to carry it down into these little valleys. And then it can be perceived. When you have like dry mouth, or for example, you might have a weakened sense of taste just because you don't have the saliva necessary for the chemicals to dissolve down into those valleys. So your sense of taste is going to be facilitated by 3 different cranial nerves. So I mentioned the spinal nerves before that branch off of the spinal cord, but you also have 12 pairs of cranial nerves that branch off of the brain. 3 of them are going to be important in facilitating your sense of taste. Cranial nerves 7, 9, and 10 are going to be important for sending taste signals to the brain. All right. And what those neurons are picking up on is just the presence of different molecules there. So if there are sodium ions present, we perceive that as salty. Hydrogen ions are perceived as sour. Monosaccharides are perceived as sweet. Nitrogenous or alkaline compounds are usually perceived as bitter. And then glutamate compounds are perceived as being savory or umami. Right? And that's it. That's all the stuff you can taste. Everything else, so when you taste something and it's got a lot of complexity to it, what you're actually doing is smelling it. So your sense of smell is much more sophisticated than your sense of taste, right? So you have the ability to smell thousands of things versus just the 5 things you can taste. So your sense of smell, very sophisticated, and it sits right at the top of your nasal cavity. So as you're breathing in air, that air is going to pass through. We talked about these bones here last time, the superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha. But way at the top of this is the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. Right? And that's serving as a barrier between your brain and your nasal cavity. And there are tiny little pores in that bone where neurons can branch through, and they can detect chemicals that are inhaled. Right? So you can see that here's the bone, here's a pore in the bone, the little neurons that are reaching through. And then we've got this olfactory epithelium. So epithelial tissue that's got neurons kind of piercing down through it that are picking up molecules that you're inhaling, right? Those molecules, when they touch the dendrites here, will trigger an action potential that goes through those neurons into the brain. Olfaction is full of really rapidly adapting neurons. And that means that since you have the ability to smell so many different things, after a while, your brain just kind of turns off that sense of smell. So this is why, in the Febreze commercials, they say nose blind. You stop smelling a thing after you've smelled it for a certain amount of time. It's just too much processing information for your brain. Brain already knows it's there. You stop smelling it. So that's a rapidly adapting pathway. Now, if you were to like leave the room and go back in, you would smell it again. But if you've just been exposed to the same smell after several minutes, usually the pathway adapts and you're no longer sort of aware of it. All right, so we got gustation, we got olfaction. Next special sense is hearing. So hearing is processed in the ear. You've got another special sense in the ear as well, and that's equilibrium. So your ear is actually responsible for 2 of your special senses. Look at the anatomy of the ear here. We can divide it into external, middle, and internal ear. The external ear is, the part of the ear that you can see, essentially, going through this external auditory canal until we hit the tympanic membrane. The external auditory canal is lined with ceruminous glands. Those are glands that produce earwax, right? There's also hairs in there, and the hairs and the earwax serve a protective function so that if anything kind of debris, dust, bugs, whatever tries to get in there, it's going to get caught in the hairs and the earwax, and that gets pulled out. Right, and the external ear ends at the structure here, which is your eardrum or tympanic membrane. That's going to be responsible for catching sound waves and vibrating as a response to those sound waves. So the external part of the ear, this is called the auricle. It's basically a big funnel, right? So your ear acts as a funnel. It's going to catch sound waves and funnel them through the external auditory canal until they hit that tympanic membrane and cause the tympanic membrane to vibrate. When it vibrates, it's going to trigger the vibration of these little bones in the middle ear. The middle ear is here. This is an air-filled chamber with 3 of the tiniest bones in your body, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Their job there is to increase the vibration or amplify the vibration that's coming from the tympanic membrane. So when the tympanic membrane vibrates, it causes those bones to vibrate as well. And then they'll send that vibration to the inner ear. Here, it's totally encased in bone inside the temporal bone. So, but the middle ear here, where we find the malleus, incus, and stapes, this is an air-filled chamber. There is a pathway from the middle ear to the back of your throat. It's called the auditory tube or eustachian tube. Connects the middle ear to the throat, which is why ear infections can become throat infections or vice versa, because there's a direct pathway there. And this that pathway, it serves a function, right? And the function is mainly to help equalize pressure on either side of the eardrum. So we don't want pressure building up on the inside of the ear and causing damage. So we have a way to relieve that pressure. So if you feel your ears building up pressure, or you feel like you need to pop your ears, that's when you kind of yawn or chew gum or do something that's going to help get air to pass through that eustachian tube and equal out the pressure. All right. So malleus, incus, and stapes from the middle ear, the last one of those bones, the stapes, is going to reach out and touch the inner ear. Right? So the inner ear, like we said, is completely encased in bone. It's within the temporal bone. The stapes kind of blocks the entryway to that bony labyrinth, we call it. It's called the oval window. Right? So the stapes sort of covers this oval window. But this is going to be the entry point into the two major parts of the inner ear, which are the cochlea, which is where sound is interpreted. And then this other part is called the vestibule and semicircular canals. That's where your sense of equilibrium is housed. So again, two special senses in the inner ear. For sense of sound, processing of sound is going to happen in that cochlea. So if the cochlea kind of looks like a snail, it's all coiled up. If we do a cross section through that snail, we can see that it's divided into these three basic chambers here. The middle chamber of which has very delicate structure called the organs of Corti. This is where sound waves that have been passed from the external ear through the bones of the middle ear into this internal ear. That's where those sound waves are going to be transduced into electrical activity. So the sound flowing through is just waves that are those waves are going to pass by the little hair cells in this organ of Corti, trigger an action potential, send that message to the brain. So we basically, when the sound waves come through, the stapes hits on this oval window that starts a wave of fluid, right? So the inner ear is fluid, middle ear is air, inner ear has fluid. The wave of fluid is going to trigger the hair cells on the organs of Corti, and different frequencies are going to be interpreted at different places within the cochlea. So the highest frequencies are near the entry, the lowest frequencies are near the tip of the cochlea. And whatever frequencies they are, they're all going to be sent through the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is your cranial nerve 8. All right, so here's the whole pathway of sound. So sounds come in through the external auditory canal. These waves of sound hit the tympanic membrane here, causing it to vibrate. That vibration is amplified by the malleus, incus, and stapes. When the stapes vibrates, it starts a wave of fluid in the internal ear, and that wave of fluid is going to go all the way through the cochlea to the apex and then reverberate out the other side of it. But whatever frequency that sound is going to trigger an action potential in a particular region of the organs of Corti and send that message to the brain. How's our sense of hearing? How do we feel about that? Or any questions? All right, and let's look at equilibrium. So sense of equilibrium is in your vestibular apparatus and semicircular canals. Equilibrium is just balance. And you've got two senses of balance, static and dynamic. Static equilibrium is basically just the position of your head, right? So this tells you whether your head is down or up or side to side. And static equilibrium is uses gravity to tell you where your head is. So within these structures, the utricle and saccule of the vestibular apparatus, there are these tiny little, what we call otoliths or ear stones. And all they do is they flow with gravity. So if your head goes from one side to the other, those little ear stones are going to roll from one side to the other. As they're doing that, they trigger little tiny hair cells, little neurons, and let your brain know that the head has changed position. So that's static equilibrium, just changes in the position of the head, using gravity as a way to interpret that. For dynamic equilibrium, so dynamic equilibrium has to do with movement, right? Keeping your balance as you're moving. Dynamic equilibrium is processed in these semicircular canals, so these big loops that kind of extend off of the vestibular apparatus. The dynamic equilibrium has to do with inertia. So instead of gravity, it's inertia. So as a thing in motion tends to stay in motion, these little structures called cupulas inside those semicircular canals will move as you move, and then there's inertia that's kind of left over. And the interpretation of that is how you figure out where you're moving, right? And how to keep your balance as you're moving. So there's another view of that. So again, you've got 3 of these semicircular canals, which is why you can control your balance in all 3 dimensions, back and forth, side to side, up and down. All right, so that's sense of equilibrium. We'll move on to a sense of sight or vision. Your sense of vision, there are a lot of specialized structures here, so a lot of anatomy. Your eye, anterior surface of the eye is obviously covered in your eyelids. So the palpebrae is the scientific term for those. So eyelids are able to close to protect the surface of the eye. And then there's this membrane that covers the anterior surface of the eyeball and also the insides of the eyelids, and that's called the conjunctiva. So the conjunctival membrane is a clear membrane. It just protects both of those surfaces. All right. Attached to the eyeball itself are these 6 different extraocular muscles. So extraocular muscles attach to the eyes and help move them, side to side, up and down, or diagonally, right? So that your eyes can track what you're looking at. These extraocular muscles are again controlled by cranial nerves. Cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6 are the ones that are mostly responsible for controlling eye movement, including closing of the eyelid and the pupillary reflex, so whether your pupils are dilated or constricted. Okay, so there's another view from the side, and you can see eyelids. This is the thinnest skin of anywhere on your body. So within the eyelids, we've got these what are called tarsal plates that help protect the eyelids to prevent them from tearing, just because that skin is so thin. You can see the conjunctival membrane sort of covering the inside of the eyelid and the front of the eye, and then we can see the eyeball itself. Sort of superior and lateral to the eyeball are the lacrimal glands. Lacrimal glands are responsible for creating tears. So they generate lacrimal fluid that washes over the surface of the eye and then drains out these nasolacrimal ducts into the nose, which is why when you're crying, your nose is watering as well, because that's where all that fluid ends up going. If your eyes are watery, it's either overproduction of lacrimal fluid or there's a blocked nasolacrimal duct. and the fluid is not able to drain out to the nose where it should, right? And that happens frequently, like with allergies or with, just any kind of cold inflammation can block those ducts. All right, so let's look at the eyeball itself then. So there's 3 layers to the eyeball. The outermost layer is called the fibrous tunic. Fibrous tunic consists of the cornea, which is this clear anterior surface, and then the sclera, which is the white part of the eyes. So sclera and cornea are both fibrous tunic. The middle layer is called the vascular tunic. That's composed primarily of choroid. You see the choroid layer there. And then this ciliary body here, as well as the iris, which is the colored pigmented part of the eye. All of that is part of the vascular tunic. And then the innermost tunic is called the nervous tunic, and that's the retina. So the retina, which is actually where the neurons are that perceive vision. Okay, so here's another look at those 3 tunics. So fibrous tunic, vascular tunic, and then the innermost one is the nervous tunic. And we can see that the cornea, this outermost part, is going to be clear, allowing light to pass through. Light's then going to go through the pupil. The pupil is like, it's just the absence of a structure. It's basically a hole in the iris. And then just behind the iris, we find the lens. The lens is going to be the part of the eye responsible for bending the light so that it hits the correct part of the retina back here. And the retina, again, that's the nervous tunic. That's where the actual photoneurons are that are able to pick up light signals and send those out the optic nerve back here towards the brain. The middle tunic, we mentioned that's the vascular tunic where we have the choroid. We've also got the ciliary body there in the iris. So the ciliary body, it's actually a little muscle that's connected by these little suspensory ligaments to the lens. That's going to help hold the lens in place and then also pull on it to stretch it out. So we can stretch the lens thin or we can plump it up. And changes in the shape of the lens is what allows you to change your focus. So when you focus on something far or something close, it's because your lens is changing shape and changing the way that light is bent towards the retina. Okay. And then the iris right here and over here, it's actually a complete circle. But since this is a section through it, that's the pigmented part of the eye. So whether you have brown eyes, blue eyes, whatever, that's pigment from the iris itself, which is also muscle, right? So the iris muscles are what are able to constrict your pupil or dilate your pupil because the way those muscles either contract or relax. All right, and then the innermost tunic or the retina, again, this is where your photoreceptor cells are. The photoreceptors are going to be able to pick up on photons or light and send that information to the brain. This is what your eye doctor sees when they're looking into your eyes. So they're looking at the retina. A couple things to notice here about the retina. One, this part right in the middle, this is the macula. And at the very center of the macula is this little kind of indentation called the fovea centralis. This is the area of your sharpest vision. So this is where you've got this very high density of photoreceptors that are able to pick up on vision really clearly. Over here is your optic disc. The optic disc is where all the axons from all of those neurons leave the eyeball and go out the optic nerve towards the brain. So your optic disc is actually a blind spot. There's no photoreception happening at the optic disc because that's where all those neurons are leaving. Okay, so here you can see why it's a blind spot. So over here, above the optic disc, we've got all these photoreceptors. Below it, all these photoreceptors, but right where the neurons are leaving, there's no photoreception happening. Right, so these are just exit pathways. So you actually do have blind spot in each eyeball. Usually you don't notice it. Your brain just kind of puts the picture together and makes up for what's missing. All right. So two different types of photoreceptor cells are your rods and your cones. So rods are just picking up white light. So the difference between the light and dark. Your cones pick up color. So um, rods tend to be focused around the periphery of your vision. And these are what allow you to see at nighttime. They don't need much light in order to pick up signals. So that allows you to see in low light situations. Low light black and white images are perceived by rods. Your cones pick up color. These are more focused in the middle of the retina at that fovea. Right? You've got three different types of cones, and they pick up overlapping wavelengths of light. So you've got red, green, and blue. And it's combinations of those three that allow you to see all across the visual spectrum of light. So if we're picking up a red cone here and a green cone there, your brain puts those together and perceives that as being orange. Another look at the different wavelengths of the visual spectrum. Right, and this is all your cones are capable of picking up. Anything below about 400 nanometers is going to be ultraviolet. Anything above about 700 is infrared. Okay. Color blindness usually has to do with the lack of a certain type of cone. So you're missing your red cones or green cones or both. That'll lead to color blindness, and usually that's genetic. Night blindness or nyctalopia is a deficiency in the pigment that's used by the rods. So the rods use a certain pigment called rhodopsin to be able to pick up low light situations. And if you're low on that pigment, that leads to night blindness. Also really common in the elderly as the number of rods you have declines with age. All right, so I already mentioned the lens there. So again, this is the structure here that sits right in the pupil, essentially, in that hole between the boundaries of the iris. And that's responsible for bending the light, the retina appropriately. We also have fluid here. So there's fluid in front of the lens and fluid behind the lens. And maintaining the fluid here is really important. Right? So the fluid fills up your eyeball and helps keep the eyeball inflated. And it's totally clear fluid to allow light to pass through, but we need to have it there because it helps to bathe those tissues. They're living cells, they need nutrients and they need to eliminate wastes. The fluid is being constantly recycled, and we have to maintain the just right amount of it. If you don't have the right amount of fluid, say that you have too much, that increases the pressure on the eye, what we call your intraocular pressure, and that leads to glaucoma. So glaucoma is this increase in intraocular pressure. And you can imagine, again, we've got a structure here that's encased in bone. We've got a fibrous tunic surrounding it. There's not a whole lot of room for expansion. So if you've got too much fluid in there, it starts to put pressure on the retina itself. If you do that, it can cause damage to your sense of sight. Questions about vision? Alrighty, we will just briefly touch on the autonomic nervous system here before we move into endocrine. So remember, autonomic nervous system, this is the automatic, right? This is stuff that you're not consciously controlling. So we can subdivide autonomic into sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is going to be that fight or flight. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. This part of your nervous system is going to be controlling, instead of controlling your skeletal muscles the way that your somatic nervous system did, this is going to be controlling smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, right? All the kind of stuff that you don't have conscious control over. That's what your autonomic nervous system is controlling, right? So we still have the same pathways. So sensory messages coming in, integrating that in the brain and sending efferent pathways out. The difference is that the sensory information here is usually internal. So it's picking up on things like the chemical composition of your blood, right? Does the blood have too much carbon dioxide? Send that sensory information to the brain. The brain will respond by increasing your respiratory rate, right? So it's going to be all this sort of subconscious or unconscious control over body systems. So we'll skip past that one and just look at the reflex arc here. So the reflex arc, again, very similar to what we already looked at. So we've got a stimulus being carried by a sensory neuron to the brain and spinal cord. We've got an interneuron sending out an efferent motor pathway, except that this efferent motor pathway, instead of just being one neuron, now we've got two. So we've got a neuron that leaves the spinal cord, and then it synapses with another neuron here that's going to take us to whatever the target cell might be, which is going to be a smooth muscle, a cardiac muscle, or a gland. Okay, but a two neuron efferent pathway. All right. So fight or flight versus rest and digest. Your sympathetic nervous system controls fight or flight, and the neurons that control this are branching off of the thoracic and lumbar portions of your spinal cord, so thoracolumbar. They're going to pretty much everywhere, right? So they go to a lot of the major organs in your thoracic and abdominal cavities, and that's what's controlling the things that we associate with fight or flight. So your heart rate goes up, your breathing goes up. We're going to send more blood to your brain, your heart, your skeletal muscles. We're going to send less blood to your digestive and reproductive organs because those are not as important if you're in a fight or flight situation. All right, so your fight or flight or sympathetic response tends to be this widespread response because of the way that the neurons are arranged. They're reaching out and touching all of these internal organs such that when something scary is happening, we're going to get this really quick response so that we can save your life, right? So whether it's, you're in a near miss car accident or you're being chased by somebody or a lion back in the old days, right? Something scary is happening, it's going to trigger this widespread massive response where you're going to be capable of either fighting or fleeing, or sometimes you freeze. So there's your fight or flight response. The opposite of that is going to be your parasympathetic. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. This is the one that's in control most of the time. So most of the time you should be under parasympathetic control. Parasympathetic is going to calm you, right? It's going to help you digest your food. And it's, instead of being this kind of widespread, massive, like overwhelming response, it tends to be more detailed and you can single out particular organ systems to handle whatever needs to be handled. And again, it has to do with the anatomy of the way the system is. We won't get into too much detail on where those neurons are, where the ganglia are, but just know that the major nerves that are controlling your parasympathetic response branch off of the brain itself and the sacral part of the spine. So yeah, your parasympathetic response is much more finely controlled than the sympathetic response. And again, it's rest, digest, process your food. No need to run away or fight or flee. Skip past that. All right, so again, the basics of what your sympathetic nervous system is doing. It's going to increase your heart rate. It's going to increase the force of your heart, so higher blood pressure. It's going to constrict blood flow to areas that are non-essential. So like your reproductive and digestive, not essential during a fight or flight situation. So we constrict blood flow there, increase blood flow to the brain, to the lungs, to the heart, to the skeletal muscles. It's going to increase your breathing. It's going to encourage higher blood sugar, right? So we get more fuel in your blood so that your skeletal muscles, heart, lungs, and brain can use that fuel. And again, decrease in GI activity. You just don't need it at that moment. And we're going to dilate the pupils, the most visual information we can into the body to help save you. Things that the parasympathetic nervous system does, we can kind of sum up with this acronym SLUD. Right? So SLUD stands for salivation, lacrimation, which is crying, urination, digestion, and defecation. So these are things that are, when you're resting and digesting, you don't need any of that kind of like hyper awareness. You can just salivate, digest your food, eliminate the wastes. Your heart rate will go down, your respiratory rate will go down, and your pupils will constrict because there's nothing scary happening. All right. How do we do on nervous system? Any questions about any of that? Great. Well, we'll cover endocrine system real quick here, and then I'll let you guys go. All right. So your endocrine system works with your nervous system. So these two work together. They both serve kind of similar functions. They're sending and receiving messages. The endocrine system is going to work by sending chemical messages, whereas the nervous system sent electrical signals. Okay, so electrical in the nervous system, chemical in the endocrine system. Right. The chemical signals that the endocrine system uses are called hormones. So these are blood chemicals that are released by glands and go to target cells throughout the body to trigger a response in those target cells. Okay. So the endocrine system, because we're sending hormones through the blood and they have to reach a target cell, that happens much more slowly than the nervous system. Nervous system sends a very quick electrical signal directly to a postsynaptic cell. So nervous system is fast. The endocrine system is slow. So it could take minutes, hours, sometimes days to get a full response from the endocrine system. Okay. Endocrine glands are spread all throughout the body. So we're not going to have time to talk about all of the glands in the endocrine system, but we'll hit some of the major ones here. All right. The glands produce hormones, and those hormones we can sort of classify based on their function. We can also classify them based on their structure. And in my opinion, the structural classification is sort of more important because of how those different structural hormones are perceived by the body. So the two major types of structural hormone are a steroid and a non-steroid hormone. Right? A steroid hormone is one that's made from the cholesterol molecule. It is a fat-based molecule. A non-steroid hormone is a protein-based molecule. So fats and proteins act very differently, and they have to be sent through the body differently, and they're perceived by their target cells differently. Right? So steroid hormones versus non-steroid. Right. Either way, that hormone has to reach a target cell. Not every cell has a receptor for a certain hormone. Right? So in order for a hormone to do anything, the target cell has to be there. Okay, so if we're looking at a hormone going through the blood, some cells have a receptor, some cells don't, right? These non-target cells don't have a receptor for that hormone, so you can throw as much hormone at those cells as you want, they're not going to respond because they don't have a receptor for it. Let's look how steroid hormones affect their target cells. One, these steroid hormones, because they're fat-based and because your cell membranes are fat-based, they can easily slip through a cell membrane and get inside the cell to trigger a response. Right? So steroid hormones easily get inside their target cells to trigger a response. They have a hard time getting through the blood, right? So because they're fat-based and fat and water don't get along, right? Oil and water don't mix. A fat-based hormone is going to need an escort to travel through your blood. So all of your steroid hormones are going to use plasma proteins as a carrier molecule to get them through the blood until they reach their target cells. Once they get to the target cell, they easily slip through the fatty membrane and get to a receptor inside cell. Your non-steroid hormones you can think of as being almost completely opposite of that. The non-steroid hormones are protein-based molecules. They travel easily in the blood, but when they reach the cell, their target cell, they hit a wall, right? Because they're protein-based molecules, they cannot get through the cell membrane. They have to use what we call a second messenger. So it's basically like a relay. The non-steroid hormone reaches the cell, hands over the message to a second messenger on the inside of the cell. So that's what's happening here. We've got our protein hitting the surface of the cell and then triggering a second messenger on the inside of the cell. So regulation of hormone secretion is going to come from mainly from the brain, right? We talked about how the brain and the endocrine system are really tightly linked because of the hypothalamus in the brain being directly connected to the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland being sort of like the master gland of all of your endocrine glands. They're going to work through negative feedback loops. Just like how we talked about in week 1, how almost all homeostasis is maintained through negative feedback loops, meaning we want to stay in that kind of stable internal conditions. And if we stray from those, a negative feedback loop will bring us back. Right? So whether we're too high or too low on whatever it might be, we're going to go back to homeostasis. So here's an example of a negative feedback loop for your endocrine system. So here we can see mom is nursing a baby. So the baby is drinking milk. Milk has a high amount of calcium in it. So as the baby is drinking milk, that's going to deplete mom's blood calcium levels. Right? She's using calcium to create milk. Her blood calcium level will then go down as she nurses the baby. That's going to trigger sensors that say, hey, we need to maintain a certain amount of blood calcium. If we're too low, we got to bring that back up to homeostasis. So the endocrine system is going to kick in here. These little glands on the back of your thyroid called the parathyroids are going to release a hormone called parathyroid hormone into the blood. That's going to circulate throughout the blood until it reaches its target cells. In this case, the target cells for parathyroid hormone are in your bones. Right? So these are osteoclasts, the ones responsible for eating away at bony tissue. They will eat away at your bone and release the calcium that was locked in the bony matrix back into the bloodstream until blood calcium levels go back up to normal. And then we can shut off production of parathyroid hormone. So it's a big negative feedback loop until we get our calcium back to where it should be. All right, so that's just an example of a negative feedback loop. Your endocrine system is a whole bunch of negative feedback loops, right? And there are, some of them are pretty concise, like that one, and some of them are much longer, where we've got several different pieces and parts. So we'll start with the hypothalamus here. Again, part of the brain responsible for homeostasis, but it is directly talking to the pituitary gland, which talks to your other endocrine glands. So again, here's hypothalamus, and then down here is the pituitary. So the hypothalamus is going to release hormones that go to the pituitary and tell the pituitary to release other hormones. So a second step in that kind of feedback loop there. Notice here that your hypothalamic hormones are mainly your releasing hormones because they tell the pituitary to release their hormones. They do this through the hypophyseal portal system, which is just a blood pathway between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So hypothalamus releases a hormone, goes through these tiny blood vessels through the infundibulum and down into the pituitary. Well, they will tell the pituitary to release their hormones that then go to another gland. So there are two parts to the pituitary, the anterior and posterior. They each have different hormones. The anterior pituitary has 6 major hormones that it releases. So the first is growth hormone. Growth hormone is going to trigger growth, right? So it triggers growth and anabolic activity in a lot of the cells of your body. It also releases prolactin. Prolactin encourages development of milk in the breast tissue. Thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, triggers activity in the thyroid gland. So pituitary tells the thyroid gland what to do. ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. This one gets released from the anterior pituitary and goes to the adrenal glands, tells them what to do. And then follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These are gonadotropins. They are going to go to the gonads and tell the ovaries and testes what to do. Okay, so you can see why that pituitary gland gets its name as sort of like the gland in control, because it's telling so many of your other endocrine glands what to do. Okay, so here's a slightly longer feedback loop. So up here in the hypothalamus in the brain, the hypothalamus releases TRH, or thyrotropin releasing hormone, which goes to the anterior pituitary and tells it to release TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, which leaves the pituitary, goes through the blood to the thyroid gland and tells the thyroid to release its 2 hormones, T3 and T4, right? And once we've got enough T3 and T4, then we can shut off that feedback loop and stop producing TRH, which slows down production of TSH, which slows down production of T3, T4. So you get the idea, right? We're just completing the loop. Posterior pituitary just has 2 hormones. Those are going to be antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. So antidiuretic does what it sounds like it does. It blocks diuresis, or urination. So maintains water, right? Basically helps you hold on to fluid, and holding on to fluid increases your blood pressure. Oxytocin has a bunch of different jobs. One of the main ones is to stimulate contraction of the uterine muscles during labor to help push the baby out. Also helps to release milk during nursing. And also acts as sort of like a bonding hormone, creates attachments between mother and baby. So we can look at the different hormones and how too much or too little of a particular hormone causes different physiological disorders. So gigantism, for example, here is an increase in growth hormone during youth. That allows the long bones to get very, very long. Pituitary dwarfism is not releasing enough growth hormone. And so you have the opposite issue where you're not producing enough of that. So the bones do not get as long as they could. Pineal gland. So this is a gland that's within the brain, but it secretes a hormone, right? So the pineal gland is going to secrete the hormone melatonin. Melatonin is your body's response to low light levels. So um, as the sun goes down and there's less light coming in through your eyes, your brain will start to release melatonin, and that's going to be a signal that it's time to go to sleep at night. All right, down to the thyroid. So thyroid is in the neck, sort of anterior to the trachea. The thyroid gland produces really three hormones. Two of the hormones are related to metabolism or your body's metabolic rate. And those are T3 and T4. T3 and T4 are they're sort of synergists. They have the same function, which is to activate your mitochondria. They make your mitochondria, all of your cells work faster to produce more energy from the food that you eat. So a slowdown in the production of those hormones can lead to slower metabolic rates. And then the last hormone produced by the thyroid is calcitonin. This one helps you control your blood calcium levels. It will actually decrease blood calcium levels if they get too high. There's your thyroid. It's a little like butterfly shaped gland right in front of your throat, just below your voice box. There's a histological view of it. And here's the feedback loop associated with that, right? So if say metabolic rates are too low, the thyrotropin releasing hormone will leave the hypothalamus, go to the anterior pituitary. TSH will leave the anterior pituitary and go to the thyroid. That'll cause the release of T3 and T4, which increases your basal metabolic rate by activating mitochondria throughout the body. And then as that metabolic rate picks up, we can shut the feedback loop off, right, or slow it back down. A goiter, so this is a thyroid disorder that can be the result of a couple different factors. Worldwide, goiters usually are associated with low iodine levels in the diet because your thyroid needs iodine to be able to manufacture hormones. So if it doesn't have iodine, those feedback loops never shut off, and the thyroid will get constant stimulation from the pituitary, which causes it to overgrow, like this poor lady here. But there could be other hormone imbalances or endocrine imbalances that cause that goiter to happen. Hyperthyroidism is overproduction of those thyroid hormones that lead to an increased metabolic rate and all of the symptoms associated with that. Graves' disease is an autoimmune version of a hyperthyroidism. So it's hyperthyroidism caused by your body's immune system that are basically creating antibodies that act like thyroid stimulating hormone. Hypothyroid would be the opposite, so lower than normal thyroid production, which is going to slow down the body's metabolic rate and basically slow down everything in the body. So you have a harder time keeping warm and harder time burning energy. Okay. And then calcitonin. So calcitonin is going to help with maintaining blood calcium levels. It actually lowers them when they're too high and tells your bones to kind of suck some of that calcium back up. Parathyroid, we already mentioned, but parathyroid glands are on the back of the thyroid, and they have the parathyroid hormone acts opposite to calcitonin. So they have opposite functions. Calcitonin is going to lower blood calcium. Parathyroid will raise blood calcium. Right, so a lot of different aspects of homeostasis that we're regulating here. And there you can see the parathyroids kind of sitting on the back of the thyroid gland. All right, moving down to the adrenals. So the adrenals are tiny little like triangular shaped glands that sit on top of your kidneys. The adrenal glands we can separate into cortex, which is the outermost portion of them, and then medulla, which is the inner portion. The adrenal cortex is going to produce things like glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids that help control the way that your body processes electrolytes and sugars. The adrenal medulla releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are going to control your body's response to stress. So here's a picture of the adrenal gland kind of sitting on top of your kidney. You see the cortex and then the medulla inside. So there's another view of the adrenal sitting on top of the kidney. All right, so the major adrenal cortex hormones. So aldosterone is a major one. You should know what that one does. So aldosterone helps you retain sodium. When you retain sodium, you also retain water. Right, so this is going to help you maintain your blood pressure. The cortex also produces cortisol, which is a glucocorticoid. That helps you, it helps determine how you're breaking down and processing or metabolizing glucose, right? And then gonatocorticoids like androgens, this is the place other than your gonads where you're producing a sex hormone. Right? And then the adrenal medulla, again, producing epinephrine and norepinephrine, which work with your sympathetic nervous system during a fight or flight response. Right? So during a very dangerous or scary situation, this increase of these hormones is going to help do all of the things that your sympathetic nervous system is responsible for doing, which is all a response to stress, right? So stress is going to have 3 steps to it. So we have your initial, when something initially stresses you out, you go into the stage 1 or alarm stage. Stress begins with activating the sympathetic nervous system. It's going to do all those sympathetic nervous system things, increase heart rate, increase respiratory rate, direct blood to the brain, the lungs, the heart, skeletal muscles. It's also going to trigger the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla. That's going to get you going, right? So that you're aware of the danger and you're going to protect yourself from that, whether it be an actual physical danger or like a perceived mental danger. After a while, then if the situation hasn't resolved, then you move into the resistance phase. Resistance is if the stressor continues to happen and hasn't resolved itself, then your body starts to get tired and will push you into exhaustion. So exhaustion is you've been stressed out way too long, and it starts to take its toll on your body. So you might become depressed or get sick more easily. You're tired. People even suffer heart attacks during this exhaustion phase. And the reason behind a lot of this is if you think about it historically, humans, the stressor would have been you're on the savannah and you're being chased by a lion. And either the lion wins or you do, right? But either way, that situation is going to be resolved pretty quickly. Current stressors, modern day stressors like college or trying to just maintain a household or the things that stress us now tend to be these longer term things that aren't resolved as easily. So we tend to spend more of our time in that exhaustion phase than historically humans did. All right, I know I've been talking for a long time here, so we'll finish up with the pancreas. The pancreas is both an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland. We'll talk about the endocrine function of it here, which is to produce 2 major hormones from these pancreatic islets. So the 2 major hormones that you should know for the pancreas are going to be insulin and glucagon. Glucagon is going to raise your blood sugar. So if blood sugar drops too low, glucagon helps you raise it. The insulin is going to do the opposite. So when blood sugar is high, insulin helps you get that sugar into your body's cells, so it's no longer in the blood. So it brings blood sugar down, right? So both of these are related to blood glucose balance. All right. And then here's a feedback loop associated with the pancreas. So let's say, here we go, we're starting at a normal blood glucose, 90 milligrams per deciliter. If I eat something, then what'll happen is as I eat that food, the glucose components of that food will enter into my bloodstream. My pancreas will respond by releasing insulin. The insulin will tell my cells to pick up that glucose and use it to make energy, right? So that glucose then goes into the body cells and we use it, right? That makes the blood glucose levels go back down to homeostasis, right? The opposite of that is, say it's been a while since I've eaten. I could go hypoglycemic, right? So not enough sugar in the blood. What happens then is the pancreas will release glucagon. Glucagon will tell my liver to break down some of the extra glycogen that it was holding on to and release more of that glucose component into the blood to get us back to homeostasis. So either way, we're controlling blood glucose levels. Right. Failure to do that results in one of the most common endocrine disorders, which is diabetes, right? So diabetes is either your body's not responding to insulin or not producing enough insulin, which is gonna, the key symptom here is or the key sign is the hyperglycemia, right? So you have too much sugar in the blood. You're not able to use that sugar in your body's cells. And so it tends to be washed out with the urine. So symptoms that are associated with diabetes are then going to be polyuria, which is excessive urination, polydipsia, which is excessive thirst because you're urinating so often, your body's trying to flush out that extra sugar, and then polyphagia, which is hunger. Because surprisingly, even though you've got all of this glucose in the blood, it's not getting into the cells. So your cells are actually starving for energy, which makes you hungry. So all that's associated with diabetes. All right, we finished it just in the nick of time. All right. Do we have any questions about nervous system or endocrine system? No? All right, well, if you do have any questions, just let me know. I'm going to stop the recording here. So thank you for joining me.